Hi, Tom, right? We should talk. I was just thinking, maybe you should read a little bit more outside your comfort zone. You know, maybe a little less sci-fi and fantasy and perhaps a little bit more...
Not Lord of the Rings?
No, and hear me out. Maybe... God damn it, Tim, no! I know you read a bunch of different genres. YA, NA, sci-fi, fantasy, contemporary, mystery...
Dark Scandinavian serial killer fiction.
Dark Scandinavian serial killer fiction, yes. But they're always books that you already know you're going to enjoy. They don't challenge you. I think you need to push yourself.
Push myself.
You know, like short stories and poetry and more classic novels, non-fiction, yeah?
Push myself.
No, put it down. Put it down. I know this video probably isn't gonna do that well, so thank you, patrons. And you let me buy my first colored lights ever. I love them. Up until now, any color you've seen has actually just been me taping cellophane over my lights. So want to support the channel and me, any support you can give over Patreon is immensely appreciated.
12 months ago, I challenged myself to read a lot more than I usually do, and a lot more diversely than I usually do. Not only because I kind of need to for my job, there's only so many times I can refer to The Last Airbender and A Song of Ice and Fire, but also because, as a writer, it's basically a requirement. It's the closest thing we have to an apprenticeship. Like most people, I've been reading my entire life, but one, I'm not a particularly fast reader, and two, I liked reading the same sorts of stories. So, first, I promised myself that I'd read classic science fiction. You know the books like Dune that everyone says they've read because they want to sound smart but actually haven't? Well, I read it. I read all of them. And now, I am the smart one. I wanted to read the classics that made the genre we know today, and the most surprising thing to me, and I know this sounds dumb, was just how good they were. Most of them. Here's Looking at You Foundation. I think a lot of people put these books off because they assume, and I'm kind of guilty of this myself, that they're gonna be slow and predictable or just dull and hard to read. But that's just not true. I started out with Dune, which was published in 1966, and it reads like a modern novel. Right from the first page, I found it thrilling and fast-paced. It was just brilliant. The characters and dialogue aren't wooden, and it is the closest thing to a Game of Thrones in science fiction that you will find. It is also one of the only 2 books that I have read that have given me that red wedding moment, other than in A Song of Ice and Fire. You can see so much of modern science fiction fantasy in Dune. I mean, Star Wars, Tatooine, lightsabers, sandworms, it's all in here. But the book that really sold me on this more classic sci-fi was Speaker for the Dead by Orson Scott Card, which is the sequel to Ender's Game. This wasn't just a brilliant book, but it was one of those more profound reading experiences that I have ever had. No, it's not as flashy as, say, The Expanse, but it is this deep story about faith and empathy and violence and the interconnectedness of the world and people and creating meaning for ourselves with characters who are very real and don't just exist to be representations of ideas, which is something that I find that people often associate, and sometimes rightly so, with older sci-fi. And I mean, truly, the writing itself is just beautiful. Then he came back. He always came back. Always took her into the heart of human life, into the tensions between people bound together by pain and need, helping her see the nobility in their suffering and anguish in their love. Through his eyes, she no longer saw humans as scurrying ants. So, myth busted. These books are good and you should read some of them. Is this just gonna be a video of me crapping on foundation? And if you didn't know, I casually discuss fiction, review books and board games over on my second channel, including my favorite science fiction book, Children of Time by Adrian Tchaikovsky, and why you should read it. Click the link. But I'm not gonna rave about all of the classic sci-fi I read. I do not want to send someone away who might have just read The Expanse and Skyward, which are nice, modern, fast-paced thrillers, away with the idea that they're going to enjoy all of these books. Because Foundation by Isaac Asimov. Well, Foundation is foundational, you might say, but it's not that great. It's a book about economics and religion and technology as the movers of society. But all of the ideas that it plays with in this book have been done in better and more interesting ways since 1942. It doesn't have consistent characters across the story because it makes these jumps in time, which can make it pretty hard to get invested in the story that's being told, but it also doesn't really have a particularly profound or beautiful writing style. It's very mechanical, very efficient. The Grand Master had raised his iron cane at the machine in a threatening gesture, and his lips moved rapidly and silently in purifying invocation. The thin-faced councillor at his right leaned towards him, and his straggled red moustache approached the Grand Master's ear. The ancient Asconian petulantly shrugged himself free. I don't know, didn't do much for me where like Speaker for the Dead and Hyperion were just astounding. And I get why people can find it hard to read these books. I am not a fan of telling people, you need to read these books because they're classics, when they're not going to enjoy them. Perhaps they just don't read that much. And a lot of these books are not the best books to start on. And if you ask that class of people who think they're smart because they read the classics where to start, they might say something like, oh, Foundation and Dune are just as important and easy to read, start with them. And then you go and read them, and you don't really get them, find them easy to read, and you feel bad and dumb because you're not getting it like all these other people do. But I want to be clear, if you're used to modern fiction, Dune is going to be a lot more familiar and easy to read for you. It's got so much of the structure and world and story style that you're probably already pretty familiar with. And what I will say is that Hyperion by Dan Simmons from 1989 is freaking amazing. It blew my mind. It's beautiful, the story about the stagnation of human society, the mythologization of technology. It's 7 people traveling on a pilgrimage together, giving their stories about what brings them to this strange and mystical place. So it's kind of like 7 short stories rolled into one larger story, giving us wildly different angles on one world. Now, Hyperion is a step more complicated than, say, Dune or Speaker for the Dead if you're wanting to start somewhere, partly because of the format, but it is probably the most beautifully written out of the ones that I read. Dan Simmons' ability to leave an impact with just the turn of a phrase is really impressive. But one of my other many wrong assumptions about these books was that I thought that they would be predictable, you know, because we're seeing things that we've now seen a million times before. Oh, the gods were actually ancient aliens, like seeing wood elves now after Tolkien's Middle-earth. We're kind of tired of seeing these familiar tropes that even when we look back at where they came from, they just don't hit as well as they used to. But again, wrong! But even the really old stuff, like Arthur C. Clarke's 1953 book Childhood's End, completely took me by surprise. It's about Earth being taken over by aliens, except they make life great for humanity, and they stay in their spaceships, so there's this mystery as to what they might look like. And I gotta be honest, I did actually guess what they were gonna turn out to be like, and I won't spoil it for you, but it was one of those older tropes that we've seen a lot before. So I was preparing myself to be underwhelmed, but then Arthur C. Clarke went so many layers deeper than I ever expected him to, and he actually had ideas that I haven't really seen replicated in much fiction at all since then. And the same went for William Gibson's Burning Chrome, which is packed full of ideas that have dominated the sci-punk genre for a long time, but he still did it in ways that I haven't really seen before. So, is it predictable? No. Myth busted. I do think it's fair to say that some older sci-fi isn't that easy to read or doesn't have great character writing. You know, Asimov called science fiction the branch of literature which deals with the reaction of human beings to changes in science and technology. And you can sort of see that focus coming out in some of these books. I mean, William Gibson's Neuromancer is the iconic cyberpunk book. It's the one that really codified many of the tropes we identify with the genre today. And some of them, like Neuromancer, were so packed full of new and fascinating ideas that the people kind of reading them let the fact that they didn't have the strongest characters just slide a little bit. It was easy to forgive them for not always having the clearest writing. I've got a video on my second channel called Neuromancer, or Why You Should Read Burning Chrome Instead. Basically because Neuromancer has a lot of technobabble and it switches perspectives a lot and it doesn't explain things. It is very easy to feel lost. And I don't think it's necessarily a very good thing, because the truth is that we expect a lot more from the books that follow in the wake of these founding texts that stand on their shoulders, so we almost have higher standards. And as a result, some of these may not work for you, like Foundation didn't really work for me. So if, like me, you want some more character-driven stuff, then read Burning Chrome instead of Neuromancer, and read Octavia E. Butler's Parable of the Sower instead of Foundation. I think that's a more interesting exploration of the influence of religion and politics and economics in how a world might break down and be built up than Asimov's is. Speaker for the Dead is this really character-driven, complex interplay between pain and love and guilt. There's this one passage where we learn about an AI who is kind of following Ender, the main character. She sort of watches over him as his friend, and he shuts her out just for an instant. And from his perspective, it's a tiny little moment. But then we get a whole chapter exploring what that's like for her, how it causes her this immeasurable pain, what it's like to be shut out and away from someone, for someone who can see everything, who can experience that like an eternity with attention like that. I loved that moment in this book. I think this lack of character kind of comes from the nature of the genre at times, you know, where the authors want to talk about sociology and technology and science, and that's the focus for them, and it can work, you know, even now. Like Session Lu's The Three-Body Problem trilogy with The Dark Forest and Death's End are very ideas driven, like painfully ideas driven by the third book. But they work because the ideas are so deeply compelling. Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep by Philip K. Dick, which is the book that Blade Runner is based on, was actually way more character driven than I ever thought it would be. It deals a lot with like mental health, and it does it in a pretty nuanced way, which for the 60s was pretty impressive, to be perfectly honest. But books like Childhood's End and Foundation and The Three-Body Problem are an acquired taste. They will be for some people, but sometimes it doesn't make sometimes the focus of ideas doesn't make the writing that digestible. So, old sci-fi, not character-driven. Myth busted. / a little confirmed. Secondly, I sat myself down and I said, hey, come here. Stop saying you can't read short stories. Stop saying, oh, they're just not my thing. Because this is something I hear all the time, that they just can't get into them, that they can't write them. And to them I say, I challenge you! The gauntlet has been thrown down! I read a bunch of them, some on paper, some on Kindle. Exhalation by Ted Chiang, Neon Leviathan by T.R. Napa, Burning Chrome by William Gibson, Starlight by Hannah Lee Kidder, Little Birds by Hannah Lee Kidder, Stories of Your Life and Others by Ted Chiang, The Girl with the Flammable Skirt by Amy Bender, and The Aleph and Other Stories by Jorge Louis Bourgeois. All of these have been collections, as well as tons of individual stories that I read in online magazines, too many to list here. I feel like a lot of people push these aside because they think that they're not going to be as deep, just because they don't have as much time to build it up. And you might say, oh, they're just not your thing, you just can't enjoy them, but to be honest, I find that a little bit hard to believe, because short stories aren't a genre, they're a medium. It's like someone saying that they don't enjoy films. Any films, at all, ever. You're gonna be able to find whatever you usually like reading in short story form. It's out there. There's this old story about Ernest Hemingway that when challenged to write the bestest short story he could ever write, he wrote, "For sale, baby shoes, never worn." Now, in reality, that was probably never written by him, but it does serve to show how devastating short stories can be, how much of a punch they can pack in so few words. Winnow is this beautiful snapshot into the workings of this one character's mind, into their heartbreak after a relationship breakup. What Remains of My Scifi by G.D. Angier is this beautiful exploration of what it means to live as an individual or as part of a collective through the lens of a mother-daughter relationship in the context of an AI on another planet. Exhalation is the story about truly grasping the inevitable death of the universe and everyone around you, and the sheer horror of that, and humanity's weird apathy towards it. The Girl with the Flammable Skirt is this beautiful look into the internal life of one person, into their passion and love and youth. I want to read you this quote. "But what I keep wondering about is this. The first second when she felt her skirt burning, what did she think? Before she knew it was candles, did she think she'd done it herself? With the amazing turns of her hips and the warmth of the music inside her, did she believe, for even one glorious second, that her passion had arrived?" I read a lot of contemporary and historical and magical realism, as well as sci-fi and fantasy in short stories, and it was just a great way to do it, and they left such an impact on me. So do not think that these stories are not gonna leave a mark on you. That one, myth busted. And come here, come on, I'll tell you a secret. Shh. There's a real superpower to short stories. They were the easiest way for me to diversify what I was reading without committing to a freaking novel. Because short stories are so great at taking these little snapshots of experiences and stories and styles without the framework of a full novel. So I can engage with so many different styles and genres without a huge upfront investment. I mean, don't like Exhalation? Fine. Read a story about a man with a hole in his stomach. A real hole. Don't like that one? Read a story about the weird world of Chicago. And that brings me back to classic sci-fi, and in particular, Isaac Asimov. Because I said that some of these books were a little bit hard to digest because they're character light and ideas heavy. Well, turns out it works perfectly in short story format. Isaac Asimov's short stories are fantastic. I 99% guarantee you will probably enjoy his short stories and totally recommend picking them up. The Last Question and Reason are great. Reason is about this robot that is so realistic that it refuses to believe it's a robot. And The Last Question is about the end of the universe. It gets you thinking about ownership and sentience and how these things are meant to work together. So if you want to read some of that classic sci-fi but want to skip the bad parts, pick up Asimov's short story collections and skip Foundation. Why does this feel like a hill that I am slowly dying on? And lastly, I tried to push the boundaries of the genres that I was reading. Instead of just reading Brandon Sanderson and Brandon Sanderson copycats over and over. Maybe you, like me, read a lot of fantasy and science fiction and dark Scandinavian serial killer fiction. So I read contemporary, historical, non-fiction, mystery thriller, Plato, adult dystopian, and House of Leaves, which I'm going to put in a genre on its own because if you know what this book is, God help you. Before I go any further, I do not want to mislead you that this is the first time I have ever ventured outside of sci-fi or fantasy. That is just not true. I read pretty broadly. This was just the first time that I really pushed myself to read things that I would not usually read, with the exception of short stories and non-fiction, which I didn't really read. Like, I've always read a fair number of books which deal with mental illness or a noir, YA, NA, lots more. Of course, I learned a lot from reading writing styles that I'm not that accustomed to, but more importantly, it really got me thinking about how we enjoy fiction. Beartown was not my favorite book. The story is very slow for hundreds of pages. It's got a lot of characters and it kind of expects you to remember them, but I found myself really appreciating Buckman's prose. The actual writing as a study of character voice or character dynamics, especially because it deals with similar themes to my own book. This tension in groups of how they deal with abuse. I had a similar experience with Parable of the Sower by Octavia Butler. Even though I didn't really enjoy the story or style that much, The main character of the story speaks very minimally, very economically. So when Butler used metaphors and poeticism in the story, it was really interesting to see why, when she does it so rarely, because I, as a writer, am someone who sometimes relies on metaphor a little bit too heavily. But Sandman and American Gods, both by Neil Gaiman, are phenomenal stories with incredible writing. And I weirdly couldn't get into them that much. You know, Gaiman's story structure is loose and undefined. The plots are quite meandering. It is all character and theme and atmosphere. It's more of an excuse for a world and character than a story on its own in many ways, which I found quite hard to digest, but every single line that Gaiman writes is evocative, and it had some of the most beautiful prose I think I have ever seen. Shadow could not decide whether he was looking at a moon the size of $1, a foot above his head, or whether he was looking at a moon the size of the Pacific Ocean, many thousands of miles away, nor whether there was any difference between the two ideas. Perhaps it was all a matter of the way you looked at it. And sometimes reading books that I really wasn't accustomed to was not easy. I listened to AJ Finn's The Woman in the Window on a 6.5-hour car trip there and back, and it was sold to me as this amazing psychological thriller with incredible twists. But it's like the twists were written and read by people that didn't know what a good twist was. But with all of these book shenanigans, I suppose you're wanting some book recommendations. So I'm gonna give 2 different recommendations. First, 5 books to read if you wanna read a diverse range. And 2, 5 books to read if you like sci-fi and fantasy and wanna just stick with that. All power to you. For a more diverse reading, The Anthropocene Reviewed, which is a series of essays about humanity's place in history and the universe. 2, The Testaments by Margaret Atwood, an adult dystopian, which is the sequel to The Handmaid's Tale and a beautiful personal story about the things humanity is capable of and faith and love. 3, Annihilation by Jeff Vandermeer, which is very weird, sci-fi, very different to the film, and I have not stopped thinking about it since I read it. 4, Little Birds by Hannah Lee Kidder, a collection of contemporary snapshots of the human condition, and it's also very female-centric. And The Lyrebird's Bell by Caitlin Galway, which is this deeply personable story that's just packed full of great sensory writing, and it won the Thomas Morton Prize. It's linked below, you can read it for free right now. But maybe you just want to read sci-fi and fantasy, and that's okay. Number 1, Annihilation. It makes both lists because it's that damn good. 2, Speak for the Dead. 3, Stories of Your Life by Ted Chiang. 4, Purgatory Mount by Adam Roberts, which is a story about the collapse of human civilization and morality when we can control death and life itself. And 5, Hyperion by Dan Simmons. So, good people of the internet, tell me what is the best book you've read over the last year. For me, it's probably Annihilation by Jeff Vandermeer. If you want more book discussions and reviews, go subscribe to my second channel, To the Future, link down below and up in the corner. I also have a Goodreads too, if you're onto that. I have enjoyed reading so much in the last year. It has honestly just changed my perspective and feeling, and I've read before, but this is like on another level. I've been reading my whole life, but pushing myself has been so rewarding. Part of this did come from my job because I'm always referring to books and stories, and I found that I literally couldn't read fast enough to keep up with the content that I was making. So this is my attempt. I've nearly always got an audiobook, an ebook, and a physical book on at all times, which is why my number 1 rule anywhere I go is always have a book. I want to say thanks to the patrons. You guys have made this content possible, not only because I can afford all of the books, but because, you know, I know this video won't do that well, but it's one that I think you guys might appreciate a bit. So, thank you, stay nerdy, and I'll see you in the future.